And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this podcast, we're going to continue to talk about positive, negative externalities and the Pigouvian solution to the positive and negative externalities. So first of all, let's just summarize the negative externality. When there's a negative externality, firms will tend to overproduce the good relative to the social optimum. They will tend to produce too much of the good relative to the social optimum. So they're suffering from the following inefficiency. They're suffering from the inefficiency that the costs of producing the additional units outweigh the benefits, but it still happens. It still happens. Those additional units still get produced. So they overproduce the good relative to the social optimum. And then the positive externality, and by the way, we solved this, the Pigouvian solution is you solve this with a Pigouvian tax. And that's to shift the supply curve. And so if there's a positive externality, this is where the consumers tend to consume the good relative to the social optimum. My example of that in a previous video was education. Consumers will tend to underconsume education relative to the social optimum. So this problem is benefits are greater than costs, but it fails to happen or doesn't happen, fails to happen. The extra units of the extra years of education, the student fails to go to school those extra years. The benefits outweigh the cost, but it fails to happen. And we solve that problem with a Pigouvian subsidy, and that is designed to shift the demand curve. So a negative externality is it's a supply side problem. The costs outweigh the benefits, but it still happens, and we use a Pigouvian tax to shift the supply curve and solve the problem. The positive externality is a demand side problem. The benefits outweigh the costs, but the consumer fails to purchase the good. They can under-consume the good. The additional units fails to happen even though the benefits outweigh the costs. We solve that with a Pigouvian subsidy, which is designed to shift the demand curve. So that all sounds great. These solutions, the Pigouvian tax and the Pigouvian subsidy, very, very clever ideas. But always in economics, there's no free lunch. Every solution creates a new problem. So what are the problems with the Pigouvian solution? Well, there are two problems with the Pigouvian solution. Two problems with the Pigouvian solution. The first problem is measurement. That is to say, how big does the Pigouvian tax have to be? What is the magnitude? What's the magnitude of the tax have to be, the Pigouvian tax? In order to know how much the tax needs to be, we need to know how big was the negative externality. So the pollution that exists from producing some good, how big was that negative externality? Can we put a dollar sign on that and then use that to match up with the Pigouvian tax? Well, I mean, these are numbers that are very difficult to know. It's very, very hard to know what those numbers are. Sometimes, in fact, it might just be that you can't know the numbers. They're not things that we currently can measure with current technology. And then on the positive externality side, it's the same problem. How do we measure if somebody did go an additional year of school? How do we measure how valuable that is? What is the dollar value of the positive externality? And therefore, what should be the magnitude of the Pigouvian subsidy? Knowing these numbers is really hard. Now, again, it is. We can imagine a world where we could maybe measure these things. Sometimes you can't measure them, or at least right now in the world there's some negative and positive externalities that we just lack the ability to measure. But even if we could measure it, it might be too costly. The collecting the information on how costly the positive or negative externality is, it just might be too costly to do so, and therefore it's not worth doing it. So how do we measure the size of the positive or negative externality That is a big problem in Pigouvian Solutions. And then the second problem with the Pigouvian solution, with the Pigouvian response, is even if you can measure accurately and want to implement a Pigouvian tax and a Pigouvian subsidy, politics and lobbying may get in the way. Politics and lobbying may get in the way. That is to say, maybe we can calculate the size of the negative externality from pollution, and therefore the amount of the Pigouvian tax that we need, but we won't be able to get that law passed. We won't be able to pass the Pigouvian tax because companies will lobby the government and prevent the law from getting passed. Or maybe with the positive externality of education, maybe we want to pass a law to subsidize people going to college in order to encourage more people to go. But again, maybe students and teachers would lobby and for actually too much education, so that the size of the Pigouvian subsidy gets too big, and we're no longer at the social optimum. So I don't really have a solution for these problems. I'm just saying that they exist, and so we have to recognize that they exist, and then try to find a way to fix them, or try to find another solution. Try to find another solution other than the Pigouvian response. And we will talk about on some future videos some other possible solutions, because this leads us into the work by the economist Ronald Coase. He developed some additional solutions beyond the Pigouvian responses, and we'll take a look at those on some future videos. All right, thanks for joining me. This has been Mr. Hagan again on another Econ podcast, and we'll see you on the next podcast.